Most people were taught that World War I began with a single gunshot, Sarajevo. They were told that an entire continent plunged into 4 years of industrial slaughter, simply because of tangled military alliances, imperial rivalries, and patriotic fervor. For more than a century, school textbooks have repeated the very same heroic narrative, that in the spring of 1917, the United States finally crossed the Atlantic Ocean to make the world safe for democracy. They tell you that President Woodrow Wilson was moved by moral outrage, provoked by unrestricted German submarine warfare, compelled by the intercepted Zimmermann telegram. It is an inspiring story of democratic solidarity written for national monuments and high school curricula. There is only one fundamental problem with that story. It leaves out the ledger books. Because, on the morning of March 5th, 1917, an urgent, top-secret diplomatic cable arrived at the White House. It was not written by a frontline general, nor was it composed by a military strategist analyzing trench movements in Flanders. It was sent directly by the United States Ambassador to Great Britain, Walter Hines Page. And Page was not writing about abstract ideals of freedom or international maritime law. He was writing about an impending catastrophe, financial collapse. The cable explained, in cold and terrifying detail, that the British Empire was on the absolute verge of sovereign bankruptcy. For nearly 3 years, Great Britain and France had been purchasing millions of tons of steel, wheat, gunpowder, and artillery shells from American industrial factories. To pay for this colossal mountain of war munitions, London had drained its century-old gold reserves, liquidate its citizens as private foreign securities, and borrowed billions of dollars from Wall Street banking syndicates. The center of this titanic financial web stood a single private banking house located at 23 Wall Street. J.P. Morgan and Company. By March 1917, the British Treasury had completely exhausted its physical collateral. Its emergency credit lines across the United States were officially maxed out. Sagrada Familia, and Ambassador Page delivered an unvarnished ultimatum directly to President Woodrow Wilson. If the American government did not step in immediately to replace private Wall Street loans with public taxpayers' money, Great Britain would be forced to stop payment on its contracts. If Britain stopped payment, the entire transatlantic supply chain would freeze overnight. Dozens of major American banks, holding hundreds of millions of dollars in unsecured allied overdrafts, would face immediate insolvency. Familia. American factories from Pittsburgh to Detroit would shut their doors, triggering the deepest economic depression in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Suddenly, the great moral crusade of 1917 begins to look very different. It was not merely an ideological intervention to save Western democracy from imperial autocracy. It was a multi-billion-dollar sovereign bailout, Sagrada Familia, designed to save the American financial system from the catastrophic default of its biggest customer. To understand how the wealthiest empire on earth ended up in the financial pawnshop of Manhattan, We have to look away from the battlefields of the Somme and open the confidential files of Threadneedle Street. When the guns of August 1914 roared across Europe, British Empire sat at the undisputed apex of global wealth. London was the financial capital of the planet. The city of London was its clearinghouse of British pound sterling, then was the undisputed global reserve currency. For over a century, the Pax Britannica had been anchored by a seemingly unbreakable financial mechanism, the international gold standard. Every single pound note in circulation was legally redeemable in solid, physical gold sovereigns at the Bank of England. British investors owned more than $20 billion in overseas assets, collecting interest, dividends, and shipping revenues from every continent under the sun. In the boardrooms of Whitehall and the drawing rooms of Parliament, the supreme political consensus was absolute. If war came, British financial power would effortlessly outlast any continental rival. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, Sieur da Sagrada Familia, assured the British public that the war would be financed by British wealth and won by British silver bullets. The ruling elite genuinely believed that the conflict would be swift, decisive, and over by Christmas. None of them had calculated the terrifying mathematics of modern, industrialized warfare. Within a matter of weeks, the 19th century illusion of a gentlemanly, low-cost war was obliterated in the mud of the Marne. Modern machine guns, heavy howitzers, and barbed wire demanded ammunition on a scale never before imagined by human civilization. In previous conflicts, a field artillery battery might fire a few dozen iron cannonballs over the course of an entire afternoon. At the autumn of 1914, British and French artillery batteries were burning through tens of thousands of high explosive shells in a single morning barrage. Each shell required copper from Montana, cotton from Georgia for nitrocellulose propellant, refined nitrates from Chile, and industrial steel forged in Pennsylvania furnaces. British economy, geared primarily toward peacetime textile production and commercial maritime trade, was utterly incapable of manufacturing this sheer volume of munitions at home. Almost overnight, the British war machine became completely dependent on the industrial output of North America, and American manufacturers sitting safely across 3,000 miles of ocean were not interested in patriotic British rhetoric. They demanded hard, immediate cold payment. Under the strict terms of international trade, American suppliers refused to accept British paper currency or long-term promises. They demanded payment in United States dollars or in physical gold, shipped directly to New York. By late 1914, the British Empire was consuming over £5 million every single day just to keep its armies equipped and fed. In the underground vaults of the Bank of England, the clerks began to notice a terrifying trend. The gold was draining out faster than it had ever accumulated over 200 years of colonial trade. A weekly balance sheet revealed that the imperial gold reserves were vanishing across the Atlantic Ocean, box by wooden box, loaded onto armored warships, steaming through submarine-infested waters. The British Treasury realized, with mounting panic, that if the war lasted more than 12 months, the physical gold of the empire would be entirely exhausted. The empire was facing a silent, structural crisis of liquidity. It had millions of men ready to fight, but it was rapidly running out of the only commodity that allowed them to pull the trigger: hard foreign exchange. As the financial crisis deepened in early 1915, Sagrada Familia, the British government realized it could not negotiate with hundreds of independent American arms manufacturers, grain, merchants, steel mills on its own. It needed a powerful, ruthless, and connected intermediary on American soil. It needed someone who understood the intricate mechanics of Wall Street. Someone who could command the American banking sector. Someone who possessed the clout to dictate industrial production across the United States. January 15th, 1915, a document was signed in utmost secrecy in London. The Commercial Agency Agreement. Under the terms of this extraordinary contract, British Treasury granted a single private banking institution the sole, exclusive right to act as its purchasing agent for the entire United States. That institution was J.P. Morgan and Company, presided over by John Pierpont Jack Morgan Jr. Under this agreement, no British government department, no military official, and no Allied representative was permitted to buy a single rifle, a single pound of copper, La Sagrada Familia, or a single bushel of wheat in North America without going through the partners at 23 Wall Street. A few months later, the French government signed nearly identical agreement, placing the entire procurement apparatus of the Western Allies in the hands of a dozen private American bankers. Jack Morgan and his senior partners, including Henry P. Davison, Thomas W. Lamont, and Dwight Morrow, Sagrada Familia, suddenly held more direct economic power over the Allied war effort than the British cabinet itself. Morgan established a dedicated export department inside its Manhattan headquarters, staffed by dozens of ruthless purchasing agents and commercial accountants. They negotiated contracts, dictated factory schedules, inspected quality standards, and set wholesale prices for American industrial titans like Bethlehem Steel, DuPont Powder, Remington Arms, General Electric. Therefore, for their services, J.P. Morgan and Company received a guaranteed commission, typically between 1 and 2% on the gross value of every single contract signed. As billions of dollars flowed through the export department, Morgan became the undisputed sovereign gatekeeper of transatlantic commerce. Between 1915 and 1917, J.P. Morgan and Company personally coordinated and executed more than $3 billion in Allied war purchases in the United States. In modern terms, that represents hundreds of billions of dollars in purchasing power. American industrial production soared to unprecedented heights. Corporate profits skyrocketed. Sagrada Familia and Wall Street experienced the greatest economic boom in its entire history. cities across the American Rust Belt, homed with 24-hour shifts, churning out endless trainloads of shells and locomotives, bound for the docks of New York and Hoboken. Yet beneath this staggering veneer of industrial prosperity lay an existential financial trap. J.P. Morgan and Company was not merely placing purchasing orders on behalf of London and Paris. It was also tasked with finding the money to pay for them. La Sagrada Familia. And, as the monthly bills from American manufacturers climbed toward hundreds of millions of dollars, the question of how Britain would continue to finance these purchases became a ticking financial time bomb. By the summer of 1915, the physical gold reserves of Great Britain, France, and Russia were no longer sufficient to cover the mounting deficits. Every week, fast cruiser ships of the Royal Navy crossed the Atlantic, carrying heavy wooden crates of gold bullion to the port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they were loaded onto armored railway cars, bound for the sub-treasury in New York and the Morgan vaults. CD. Over $1 billion in physical gold, representing a massive percentage of the entire world's monetary gold supply, was shipped into the United States during the first 2 years of the war. The Bank of England's vaults were echoing with empty space. Lord Cunliffe, the autocratic governor of the Bank of England, warned the Chancellor of the Exchequer that if gold shipments continued at this pace, Britain would be forced to abandon the gold standard entirely, wrecking the global credibility of the pound sterling. London had to find another form of collateral, and it had to find it immediately. The British government turned its gaze toward the private wealth of its own domestic citizens. For generations, wealthy British aristocrats, industrialists, and middle-class investors had accumulated massive portfolios of American securities, shares in the Pennsylvania Railroad, bonds in the Union Pacific, stock in American steel mills and utility companies. These foreign investments had been the bedrock of Britain's overseas imperial income. Late 1915, the British Treasury launched what became known as the Treasury Securities Mobilization Scheme. At first, the government politely requested that British citizens voluntarily loan or sell their American stocks and bonds to the Treasury in exchange for British government war bonds. When voluntary compliance proved too slow, Whitehall dropped all pretenses of gentlemanly persuasion. The British Parliament passed emergency legislation imposing a punitive confiscatory supertax of 2 shillings on the pound on any income derived from unsurrendered American securities. British citizens were effectively forced, under financial duress, to hand over their private property to the state. Sagrada Familia. Over $3 billion worth of premier American corporate stocks and railway bonds were physically seized, catalogued by Treasury clerks in London, shipped across the ocean under armed guard. Once these securities arrived in New York, J.P. Morgan and Company did not immediately dump them onto the open market, for fear of crashing Wall Street stock prices. Instead, Morgan used this colossal mountain of confiscated private paper as collateral to back new Sagrada Familia, short-term commercial loans and syndicated credit lines for the British government. The British Empire was literally pawning the accumulated capital of its Victorian ancestors, share by share, bond by